She wasn't calculating the distance anymore. She was calculating the intervals. Her left palm was a permanent fixture against the high, hard shelf of her stomach. A silent pact between her and the life inside that they would make it to the apartment before the world broke open. She'd been doing it for 3 blocks, a rhythmic, frantic inventory of her own skin. Her right hand was tucked deep into her armpit, her fingers long since gone numb because she had underestimated the bite of a Seoul winter, and the wind was currently proving her wrong with every gust. The street wasn't just empty. It was erased. That was the part the guidebooks didn't mention. How a blizzard in this city could turn a bustling thoroughfare into a sensory vacuum. The snow didn't just fall. It colonized. It muffled the neon signs and swallowed the hum of the subways until Michelle felt the city had retracted its permission for her to be there. She was a lone dark shape in a white corridor that was narrowing at both ends. She knew the math. It was 6 minutes from the convenience store to her lobby. 6 minutes, and the last contraction had peaked 4 minutes ago. She was racing a clock that was built into her own bone and muscle. She began the list of her own failures to distract herself. She had worn the fashion boots instead of the treaded ones. She had let the appointment run late. She had opted for the scenic route because the hills on the main road felt like mountains today. She was halfway through a mental apology to her unborn child when the silence of the alley snapped. She stopped. The sound wasn't a scream. Screams were easy to ignore in a city that thrived on noise. This was a whimper, thin, brittle, and vibrating at a frequency that bypassed her brain and went straight to her marrow. It was the sound of something small surrendering to the cold. Michelle stood for 3 seconds. In the life of a woman in active labor, 3 seconds is a goddamn eternity. She looked toward the light of her apartment building, visible like a blurry star at the end of the street, then back toward the throat of the dark alley. She didn't decide to turn. Her body simply realigned. It was a physical correction, a magnetic pull that ignored the screaming protest in her lower back and the ticking clock in her womb. Before her mind could tell her it was a mistake, her boots were already crunching into the unbroken snow of the alleyway. She wasn't a woman seeking a hero's moment. She was a predator of comfort, and she had just found something that needed her warmth more than she did. The alley was a throat of shadows, narrowing until the brick walls felt close enough to touch. Michelle pressed forward, her red coat dragging against the rough masonry, catching the stray flakes of a city trying to bury itself. The whimpering stopped just as she saw the flash of gold, a crest on a navy blazer, polished and defiant against the gray slush. The girl was tucked into a crawlspace behind a rusted dumpster, her small body curled into a tight, shivering knot. She wasn't just cold. She was retreating into herself, her skin a translucent, porcelain blue. Michelle didn't hesitate. She couldn't afford the luxury of a slow approach. She sank to the ground, the frozen pavement biting through her leggings, and pulled the child into the heat of her lap. "I've got you," Michelle whispered, though the words felt heavy and clumsy in the freezing air. She unbuttoned the top of her red coat, draping the heavy wool over the girl like a tent. The child didn't scream or pull away. She simply collapsed into Michelle's chest, her head finding the hollow of Michelle's collarbone with a desperate, instinctive trust. The school uniform was thin, absurdly thin for a night that felt like the end of the world. Then it hit. It wasn't a ripple this time. It was a tectonic shift. The contraction seized Michelle's midsection with a violence that made her vision blur at the edges. Her breath hitched, a sharp, jagged inhale that threatened to become a scream. She clamped her jaw shut so hard her teeth ached. She couldn't make a sound. Not here. Not when the girl's breathing was finally beginning to level out against her heart. To cry out was to break the only sanctuary this child had left. Michelle leaned her head back against the cold brick, her eyes squeezed shut. She counted the seconds in the dark, measuring the agony against the steady, rhythmic pulse of the girl's temple against her own. 1, 2, breathe. The cold of the wall was a mercy, a sharp contrast to the fire spreading through her pelvis. As the pain began its slow, agonizing retreat, the girl shifted. She let out a long, shuddering sigh, her small hand clutching a handful of Michelle's sweater. She was asleep, an exhaustion so deep it looked like a faint. Michelle looked down, her own hand shaking as she brushed a frozen strand of black hair from the girl's forehead. She was trapped. She was a woman in labor, sitting in a frozen gutter in a city where she was a ghost, holding the daughter of a man she didn't know was coming for them both. The blizzard continued its relentless descent, turning the alley into a tomb of white silence. Michelle looked toward the street, toward the safety of the lights she had abandoned, and then she looked back at the child. She pulled the red coat tighter, her body acting as a furnace for 2 lives now, her resolve hardening into something as cold and unbreakable as the ice beneath her. She would wait. Even if the city froze over, she would not let this fire go out. The silence of the alley didn't break. It was punctured. The low, rhythmic crunch of heavy boots on packed snow began at the mouth of the corridor. Too synchronized to be a random passerby, too heavy to be help. Michelle didn't move. She couldn't. Her body was a wreckage of mounting pressure and fading heat, but her mind remained a sharp, jagged glass. 3 shadows detached themselves from the white haze of the blizzard. They were silhouettes of expensive wool and hard angles, their black suits absorbing what little light escaped the street lamps. As they drew closer, the cold seemed to intensify, radiating from the clinical efficiency of their movements. They didn't look like men. They looked like a cleanup crew sent to erase a mistake. The man in the lead stopped 5 feet away. He didn't look at Michelle. His eyes were fixed on the navy blue blazer visible beneath the flare of her red coat. He reached into his jacket, a gesture so casual it was terrifying, and pulled out a phone. A brief murmur in Korean followed, a confirmation of a found asset. "Give her to us," the man said. His English was accented, stripped of any inflection. It wasn't a request. It was a statement of inevitable fact. Michelle felt the girl stir against her ribs, a small, terrified hitch in her breathing that told her the child recognized these voices and feared them. Michelle's response was a tightening of her arm, a physical locking of the gate. "No," she said. Her voice was thin, but it didn't tremble. The men exchanged a glance, a flicker of genuine confusion. In their world, a lone, pregnant woman shivering in the dirt was a variable to be discarded. One of the men stepped forward, his hand reaching out to grab the girl's shoulder. A fresh contraction hit Michelle then, a white-hot spike that drove upward through her spine. Her vision grayed out, her muscles spasmed, her body screaming at her to collapse, to let go, to surrender to the biological war happening inside her. But as the man's fingers brushed the girl's sleeve, Michelle's hand shot out, catching his wrist in a grip fueled by pure, maternal adrenaline. "I said no." She looked up at him, her eyes dark and feral beneath the hood of her coat. "She is in shock. She is freezing. If you pull her into this wind without a medic, her heart will stop. You touch her when the ambulance gets here. Not before." The man tried to pull back, but Michelle held on, her knuckles white. She was a woman whose body was failing her, whose life was literally splitting in 2. Yet she looked at the 3 armed men as if they were the ones in danger. She wasn't fighting them with strength. She was fighting them with the absolute authority of a guardian who had already decided she was willing to die in this snow. The lead man stared at her, his hand hovering near his waist. For a long, breathless minute, the only sound was the howling wind and the wet, labored breathing of a woman who refused to break. "She is the chairman's daughter," the man hissed, his eyes searching hers for a hint of fear he could exploit. "Then the chairman should have sent someone with a warmer coat," Michelle snapped, her jaw clenched against the next wave of pain. "Call a doctor. Until then, she stays with me." She didn't let go of his wrist. She simply sat there, a red beacon against a brick wall, holding the line between a little girl and the shadows that wanted her back. The world didn't return in a rush. It seeped back in through the smell of antiseptic and the hum of high-end machinery. Michelle opened her eyes to a ceiling that was too white and a silence that was too heavy. The predatory cold of the alley was gone, replaced by a climate-controlled warmth that felt artificial against her skin. She tried to shift, but her body felt like a map of dull aches and strange, hollow echoes. The frantic, rhythmic pressure in her womb had vanished, leaving behind a lightness that terrified her for exactly 1 heartbeat. Then she heard it, the soft, rhythmic sigh of a bassinet. She turned her head slowly. Beside her bed sat a transparent cradle, and within it, a bundle wrapped in pristine white linen. Her daughter. The baby was peaceful, a tiny, breathing miracle that seemed entirely unaware of the blizzard or the men in black suits. Michelle reached out, her fingers trembling as they brushed the infant's cheek, confirming the reality of her. They were safe. They were inside. But as her gaze drifted past the bassinet, the safety began to feel like a different kind of cage. This wasn't the overcrowded public ward she had planned for. The room was expansive, paneled in dark, expensive wood with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over a gray, recovering soul. There were no other patients. There were no harried nurses shouting in the hallways. Instead, two men stood like statues just outside the glass door, the same sharp-angled silhouettes from the alley, their presence a silent reminder that her debt had already been bought. On the bedside table sat a single, small item, the navy blue school blazer, now cleaned and folded with mathematical precision. Resting on top of it was a heavy, cream-colored envelope. A nurse entered, moving with a quiet grace that suggested she was used to VIPs and secrets. She checked Michelle's vitals without a word, her expression a mask of professional neutrality. The girl! Michelle's voice was a rasp, her throat feeling like it had been scrubbed with sand. The nurse paused, her eyes flickering toward the door before returning to the chart. The young mistress is recovering in the East Wing. Her father has ensured you have the best care available, Ms. Weidman. The title Young Mistress hung in the air, heavy and jagged. Michelle looked back at the blazer. She had spent 30 minutes in the snow acting as a human shield for a child she thought was a victim of a botched kidnapping. She had managed the agony of labor in silence to protect a stranger's peace. Now, the luxury of the room felt like a payment for services rendered, an attempt to bridge the gap between a woman who had nothing and a man who owned the city's shadows. She looked at her daughter, then at the men standing guard in the hallway. She had saved a life, but in doing so, she had stepped out of the nothingness of her expatriate life and into the sharp, focused glare of the Lee Syndicate. The ward was silent, but the echoes of the alley remained. She wasn't just a mother anymore. She was a variable in a very dangerous equation. He watched her through the one-way glass of the observation suite, a space designed for looking without being seen. Lee Yong-sung did not like variables he couldn't categorize, and Michelle Weidman was a glaring anomaly in his carefully ordered world. In the dim light of the monitoring room, the chairman's face was a study in stillness. On the screen, the woman was sitting up, her dark skin a sharp contrast to the clinical white of the luxury linens. She wasn't touching the gourmet meal they had brought her. She wasn't marveling at the view of the city he owned. She was simply staring at her child with an intensity that made Yong-sung's own chest tighten with an unfamiliar discomfort. He had read her file 3 times. It was a catalog of nothingness. A freelance consultant, an expatriate with a mid-tier visa. No powerful family ties, no political leverage, no hidden assets. In the hierarchy of Seoul, she was a ghost. Someone his men would usually walk past without a second glance. She held the young mistress for 28 minutes in sub-zero temperatures. His captain whispered from the corner of the room, his voice thick with a rare, begrudging respect. The doctors say she was in the 2nd stage of labor. She didn't scream once. She didn't let go even when we drew weapons. Yong-sung leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. He was a man who understood transactions. Everything had a price. Loyalty, silence, even life itself. But this woman's actions didn't fit the ledger. She hadn't known who the girl was. She hadn't known there was a reward or a debt to be claimed. She had risked her own child's life and her own survival for a whimper in the dark. To Yong-sung, her lack of status made her bravery feel like an insult to his philosophy. How could someone with nothing to lose and nothing to gain act with more resolve than his most seasoned lieutenants? He watched her reach for the baby, her movements slow and pained, yet entirely devoid of the frailty he expected. There was a quiet, unshakable sovereignty in the way she held herself. She looked like a queen ruling over a kingdom of one. "She is asking to leave, Chairman," the captain added. "She says she cannot afford this room." A ghost of a smile touched Yong-sung's mouth, though his eyes remained cold. The irony was sharp. She was worried about a hospital bill while holding the gratitude of a man who could buy the hospital itself. But he realized then that her nothingness was exactly what made her dangerous. She didn't want his money, and she didn't fear his shadow. He stood up, his coat snapping into place. He had spent his life making people small so that he could feel large. But looking at the woman in the red coat, now draped over the back of a chair like a discarded battle flag, he felt a strange, piercing need to understand the source of her heat. He didn't just want to repay her. He wanted to see if she would blink when the Dragon of Soul finally stepped out of the dark. The heavy glass door slid open with a mechanical whisper that felt like a gavel striking a desk. Michelle didn't flinch. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, her daughter cradled against her shoulder, watching the man enter. Lee Yong-sung didn't move like a visitor. He moved like the owner of the air itself. His presence was a cold front. His suit so black it seemed to pull the light from the room. He stopped at a distance that was precisely calculated to be intimidating, close enough to dominate, far enough to remain a spectator. "You are a difficult woman to find, Ms. Weidman," he began. His voice was a low, resonant rumble, polished by years of absolute authority. And an even more difficult one to understand. Michelle adjusted her grip on the infant, her eyes meeting his with a directness that usually made men in this city look at their shoes. "I wasn't hiding. I was walking home, and I think I understand the situation perfectly. You're the father. Your daughter is safe. I'd like to take mine and leave." Yong-sung's expression didn't change, but his eyes flickered toward the cream-colored envelope on the nightstand. "Inside that envelope is a check. It is enough to ensure you never have to walk in the snow again. It is enough to buy the building you were trying to reach and 10 others like it. It is a drop of water from my well, but for you, it is an ocean." He waited for the flicker of greed, the widening of the eyes, the sigh of relief that usually accompanied his mercy. Instead, Michelle looked at the envelope as if it were a piece of litter. "Keep it," she said. The silence that followed was thick, almost tactile. For the first time in a decade, the Dragon of Soul felt the rhythm of the conversation slip from his fingers. He took a step closer, his brow knitting in genuine, perplexed frustration. "Perhaps you do not realize who I am. Or perhaps you do not realize the number written on that paper. I know who you are. The nurses won't even say your name above a whisper," Michelle said, her voice growing steady, fueled by a tired, bone-deep fire. "But you're making a mistake, Mr. Lee. You think you're paying a debt. But there was no transaction in that alley. I didn't save your daughter because she was yours. I saved her because she was cold. You can't put a price on the half hour I spent praying she wouldn't feel my heart stop when the contractions hit." She stood up, her movements stiff and pained, but her spine remained a column of iron. "If I take that money, then what happened in the snow becomes a job. And I don't work for you." Yong-sung stared at her. He had dealt with assassins, corrupt officials, and rival kings, but he had never encountered a person who viewed his wealth as a devaluation of their own humanity. He looked at her. A woman with no status, no protection, and a newborn child, and realized he was looking at the only person in the city he couldn't own. "You have nothing," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, confused whisper. "I have the fact that I don't owe you anything," Michelle replied, reaching for her red coat. "And in this city, Mr. Lee, that's everything." She walked past him toward the door, her child tucked against her heart, leaving the most powerful man in Seoul standing in the center of the room, holding a check that had suddenly become worthless. The taxi ride back to her neighborhood was a blur of salt-stained windows and the neon hum of a city that had already forgotten the storm. Michelle stepped out onto the sidewalk, her body feeling like a fragile glass sculpture held together by sheer will. She expected the familiar struggle, the heavy lobby door that stuck in the frame, the flickering hallway light, and the drafty chill of her fourth-floor walk-up. Instead, the lobby door opened with a silent, oiled grace. She paused, her hand tightening on her daughter's carrier. The dim, yellowed hallway she had navigated for a year was gone, replaced by a warm, recessed glow that made the worn floorboards look like burnished gold. The air in the stairwell didn't smell of damp concrete and old cooking oil. It smelled of cedar and clean linen. By the time she reached her door, her heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She braced herself for a lock that had been tampered with, or perhaps a guard standing sentry. But the door was just a door until she pushed it open. The apartment was not transformed by the gaudy displays of wealth she had expected from a man like Lee Yong-sung. There were no silk tapestries or stacks of cash. Instead, she was met by a wall of deep, radiant heat. The old, clanking radiator had been replaced by a silent, high-efficiency system that hummed with a heartbeat of absolute reliability. Michelle walked into the kitchen, her boots clicking on a floor that no longer groaned. The refrigerator, once a graveyard of half-empty milk cartons and desperate leftovers, was now a silent sentinel of abundance. It was stocked not with caviar, but with the bone broths and nourishing greens her grandmother used to talk about for postpartum recovery. There were glass jars of fresh lactation tea, pre-cut fruit, and high-protein meals labeled in English with heating instructions. On the small wooden table sat a new baby monitor and a sleek, modern security interface, discreet, professional, and military grade. It was an uninvited warmth, a silent invasion of her autonomy that felt terrifyingly thoughtful. Yong-sung hadn't tried to buy her again. He had simply mapped her vulnerabilities and erased them. He had looked at her life and seen the cold, the hunger, and the fear, and he had used his shadow to shield her from them. She sank into her old armchair, which had been reupholstered in a fabric so soft it felt like a caress. For a moment she wanted to be angry. She wanted to throw the food out and tear the security panel from the wall. But then her daughter let out a small, contented sigh, her tiny chest rising and falling in a room that was exactly 22 degrees Celsius. Michelle leaned her head back, the red coat still draped over her shoulders. She had rejected his ocean, so he had sent a rain that she couldn't possibly turn away. She was warm, she was safe, and for the first time since arriving in Seoul, she realized that privacy was a luxury she could no longer afford. The dragon hadn't accepted her, no. He had simply changed the language of the debt. The knock on the door was not the heavy, percussive strike of a man in a black suit. It was a tentative, rhythmic tapping, low enough that it barely registered over the soft breathing of the infant in the bassinet. Michelle opened the door to find a small, navy blue silhouette against the hallway's new, warm glow. Park stood there, her school uniform pristine, her hair pulled back into a tight, severe ponytail that seemed too heavy for her small face. Behind her, a shadow lingered near the stairs, the silent, ever-present guard. But the girl stood alone in the threshold. She was carrying a small, hand-painted wooden box, her knuckles white as she gripped it. For a long moment, she didn't speak. She simply looked at Michelle with eyes that were too old, too used to assessing the shifting moods of powerful men. "Come in," Michelle said softly, stepping aside. The girl entered the apartment like she was walking through a cathedral. She didn't look at the new security panel or the expensive heater. She looked at the mismatched mugs on the counter and the pile of soft, laundered baby blankets on the sofa. To Park, the normalcy of the space was more exotic than any palace. It was a place where the air didn't vibrate with the tension of the syndicate, where silence wasn't a precursor to a threat. Michelle led her to the bassinet. Park peered over the edge, her breath hitching as she saw the baby's tiny, rhythmic movements. "Her name is Maya," Michelle whispered. Park reached out, her finger hovering an inch above the baby's hand before she pulled back, as if afraid her own life might leave a mark on something so clean. "In the alley," the girl started, her voice a fragile thread in the quiet room. "You were warm. I thought the snow had stopped, but it was just you." She placed the wooden box on the table. "My father says I cannot give you gold. He says you do not want it." She opened the lid to reveal a collection of pressed flowers and a single, smooth river stone. "These are mine, not his. I wanted you to have something that doesn't belong to the chairman." Michelle felt a lump form in her throat that no amount of Lee's herbal teas could soothe. She realized then that Park wasn't just a victim she had saved. She was a prisoner of a gilded cage, visiting a woman who lived in a world where warmth was a choice, not a strategic asset. As Park sat on the edge of the upholstered chair, her feet dangling, she finally began to relax. The tension left her shoulders, and for a fleeting 20 minutes, she wasn't the young mistress of the Lee syndicate. She was just a child watching a mother nurse a baby. She asked about the baby's socks. She laughed, a small, rusty sound, when Maya made a face in her sleep. When the guard finally tapped on the door to signal their departure, the transition was visceral. Park's face snapped back into a mask of stoic obedience. She stood up, smoothed her blazer, and became a silhouette once more. "Thank you, Michelle SSI," she said, a formal bow masking the desperation in her eyes. Michelle watched her go, the heavy door closing with that new, silent oiled click. The apartment was warm, but the normal peace felt fragile now. She looked at the wooden box of flowers and realized that by saving the daughter, she had inherited the daughter's longing. She wasn't just a bystander anymore. She was the only window Park had into a world where love didn't come with a price tag. The peace of the apartment didn't shatter. It curdled. It started with the security interface. The soft, blue glow of the panel shifted to a frantic, pulsing amber at 3 in the morning. Michelle was awake before the first chime, her body already attuned to the high-alert frequency of motherhood. She scooped Maya from the bassinet, the weight of the infant a grounding anchor as she moved toward the kitchen. She expected the silent guards. She expected the shadow of Lee Yong-sung. She did not expect the men who were currently kicking in her neighbor's door across the hall. Through the fisheye lens of the new camera, she watched silhouettes that lacked the surgical precision of the syndicate. These were rougher, louder, men who moved with the desperate violence of those trying to climb a ladder that was already on fire. They weren't here to protect the young mistress. They were here because they had identified a hole in the dragon's armor, and that hole was shaped like a black woman in a red coat. A heavy fist pounded against her own door, the wood groaning in a way it hadn't since the renovations. "Open it, expatriate," a voice growled in rough English. "We know what you are to him. We know what he's been sending here." Michelle retreated into the shadows of her hallway, her back against the cool, cedar-scented wall. Her heart was a drum, but her hands were steady. She understood this brand of threat. This was the world trying to reclaim its nothing. To these men, she was just a lever, a piece of flesh to be used to make a powerful man blink. She didn't reach for the phone to call Lee. That was the trap. If she called him, she became the pawn they wanted her to be. She became a liability he would have to manage. The door handle rattled violently. A shoulder slammed against the frame. Michelle looked at the security panel, her fingers hovering over the interface. It wasn't just a monitor. It was a weapon system she had studied in the quiet hours of nursing. "I don't work for Lee Yong-sung," she shouted, her voice cutting through the wood, pitched with a low, dangerous resonance. "And I don't belong to him. If you break this seal, you aren't fighting the syndicate. You're fighting me." She didn't wait for a response. She triggered the dispersal protocol Lee's engineers had hidden in the ventilation. A hiss of pressurized canisters filled the hallway. Not lethal, but a blinding, stinging irritant that turned the corridor into a choking fog. Through the monitor, she watched the men stumble back, clawing at their eyes, their bravado evaporating in the face of a defense they hadn't budgeted for. They expected a victim. They found a fortress. Michelle stood in the dark of her living room, clutching Maya to her chest. She watched the intruders scramble down the stairs, their retreat frantic and undignified. She had stood her ground, but the air in the apartment felt different now. The uninvited warmth had brought the wolves to her door. She had proven she could bite back, but as she looked at the amber light on the wall, she realized the city wouldn't let her stay a ghost forever. The shield Lee had built was also a target, and she was the one standing in the bullseye. The mist in the hallway had settled by the time the elevator doors opened to reveal Lee Yong-sung. He didn't come with a small army this time. He came alone, his presence stripped of its usual theatrical menace. He stood in the doorway, his eyes scanning the scuff marks on the floor and the lingering chemical haze, finally resting on Michelle. She was still standing, the red coat draped over her shoulders like a suit of armor, her daughter sleeping in the crook of her arm. He looked at the security panel, then back at her. For the first time, the dragon of soul looked tired. He saw the defiance in the set of her jaw and realized that every fence he built around her only gave his enemies a wall to climb. He had tried to protect her by owning the space around her, failing to understand that her strength was rooted in her independence. "They came because of me," he said, his voice stripped of its armor. "My gratitude has become your shadow." Michelle didn't look away. "I handled it, but I won't spend the rest of Maya's life looking through a fisheye lens, waiting for your mistakes to find my door." Yong-sung bowed his head, not a formal gesture of etiquette, but a genuine surrender. He realized that to honor the woman who had saved his heart, he had to stop trying to hold her. He had to give her the one thing his world didn't allow, the right to be forgotten. The security will be removed, he murmured. The guards will be pulled back to the perimeter of the district. You will be a ghost again, Ms. Weidman. I will give you the silence you asked for. He turned to leave, but paused at the threshold. But know this, the wind will not bite you again. The snow will not bury you. You are no longer alone in this city, even if you never see my face again. As the door clicked shut, this time with the familiar, slightly hitched sound of a normal lock, Michelle felt the air in the room change. The artificial tension evaporated. She walked to the window and watched the black sedan pull away, merging into the gray flow of the morning traffic. She looked down at Maya, then at the wooden box of pressed flowers Park had left behind. She was an expatriate in a hard city, a woman with no status and a mountain of history, but the cold felt different now. She reached out and turned off the overhead light, letting the natural dawn fill the room. She was free, but she was guarded by a silent, invisible fire. For the first time since the alley, Michelle let out a long, slow breath and simply leaned into the warmth. The red coat hung by the door, no longer a beacon of survival, but a quiet reminder of a truth the city's concrete heart usually ignored. Michelle watched the sunrise bleed across the Seoul skyline, realizing that power isn't measured in the weight of a check or the number of men standing in the shadows. It is found in the 30 minutes of silent agony spent shielding a stranger's child. It is the courage to remain soft when the world demands you turn to stone. She had learned that a debt of the soul cannot be settled with gold, only with the recognition of a shared humanity. By choosing to turn into the dark alley, she hadn't just saved a life. She had forced a predator to remember the warmth of a father. In the end, the strongest fortress isn't built of iron or wealth, but of the selfless acts that refuse to be bought. We have come to the end of this wonderful story. Now, let us know what you would have added or taken out from this story. Do not forget to like this video and subscribe to the Cinem Corner channel. Turn on notifications too, so you get notified whenever videos are uploaded. Thanks for watching and see you in the next video. Sit back, relax, and let me tell you another story.